surface of our everyday interactions, but we also knew that the dominant mask we were required to wear was one of unity, especially in the wilderness. My first exercise as the hunted individual was not successful. For Kate and I were taken to separate desolate areas, as all the hunted students are, and set loose with the lone instruction that we make it back to Bamaran without being detected by any of the hunting groups. We carried nothing but the clothes we were wearing. Once I was left to my own resources, I despaired. This was not the city. The landscape was unyielding and harsh. It held no clues that I could read as to what direction the institute was in or how far. I wandered about in the searing heat, doing everything in my power to be captured. I was in terrible agony. Of course, it took no time at all for the Furton group to accommodate me. For was captured, but only after a much longer hunt, and successfully returned to Bamaran without being detected. I was judged an abysmal failure and assigned to solitary detention, as an example of what happens to lackluster effort and to think about how I could change for the better. But it was in the pit and my work with Calyx that I suffered the most. My dreaming made me an airman. You have no grip, no focus. How can you find your strength if you can't hold your place? Living in your dreams is like living in air. His critique cut to the heart. It was only my determination to somehow find my place in Bamaran in the group, in myself, that kept me from total despair. But I was very close to giving in. After a particularly brutal session in the pit, when 3 pinned me face down in the sand and nearly broke my neck, I lingered in the training area to be alone and deal with another bitter defeat. The worst thing about it was that it was self-inflicted. I wasn't as strong as 3, but I was much smarter and my instincts were truer and faster. However, there was always one point during a stratagem where I would panic and lose control. It would happen the same way every time, a difficult move under pressure against strong physical resistance from an opponent. And something would snap. A painful blow might set it off, a whispered insult, perhaps just a thought or a feeling of hopelessness, and I would suddenly lose control and lash out like a madman. I became suffused with a raging, crimson anger that poured out from some black hole somewhere deep inside me. At first I appeared ferocious, and my opponent would back off. But it was 8, of course, who efficiently exposed my lack of strategic control and the utter impotence of such behavior. Without 8, 3 would never have gotten past my berserker appearance. As I sat on a bench and went over the moves that had led to my latest failure, I heard a female voice in the adjoining area. The voice was saying something about what constitutes a crime in a covert assignment. I heard no voice in reply, and I thought I was having another one of my visions. I started to leave before it took over. This was the last thing I wanted. But the sweetness of the voice stopped me. It had a piping and melodic lilt, firm and confident, and there was a soothing quality as it spoke of dry legal definitions. It acted as a balm for my bruises and bitterness. I began to feel such longings. It was like hearing music that you love when you least expect it. How I missed Mother, and working with Father in the flower beds. How I longed for home. I dropped my guard and surrendered to the voice. The tears I was determined never to shed accompanied choking waves of shame and relief, sadness and joy. I finally was able to admit to myself how unhappy I was. I had lost track of the voice. When I was able to exercise some control, I began to pull myself together before someone saw me. I used my dirty tunic to wipe my eyes, looked around. And there she was. The young woman from my vision in the pit. Except that I knew from her look of concern that this was not a vision. Are you hurt? She asked. I wanted to hide. I wanted to say yes. I just looked at her. How could her eyes be both so clear and so unfathomably black? Thank you. I managed. For what? She was confused, concerned, but I could see the hint of amusement in her look. Adobe Digital Editions. Star Trek menu. Adobe Digital Editions. Star Trek Deep Space Nine. The Stitch in Time. Andrew J. Robinson. EPUB window. Focus on book content text. You have a pleasant voice. Pleasant? I think I actually cringed. But she laughed at this. She had such a delighted look on her face. Then was it something I said? She asked. What? I had no idea what she meant. If my voice didn't make you cry, it must have been my speech. She continued to laugh. I don't blame you. The establishment of the Habaric Code and its relevance to covert intelligence missions is enough to make the angels weep. What are angels? A human religious tradition? You get all that in second level. It's a lot more fun than Foundations of Cartesian Law. Are you alright? Yes. I'm. I shook my head, embarrassed. Homesick. I know. This can be such a cruel place. But you know the secret, don't you? She asked this with exaggerated confidentiality, looking around as if there might be spies. I was still getting used to her manner, and I looked around as well in case there really were. No. I don't think so. Your sense of humor. Without it you're lost. I wasn't sure I understood. You strike me as being very serious and ambitious. That's fine, most of the students are, she patiently explained. But it's pretty funny around here. I don't know. I was dubious to say the least. No, really. You study with Calyx, don't you? Yes, I glumly answered. I know. The pit wasn't my favorite place either, but look at his eyes when he's instructing or when he watches the others. There's a glint. He's enjoying himself. What's your name? Tenlubac. No, your real name. But we're not supposed to. I stammered, truly shocked. I am not going to tell anyone. My name is Palandine. What's yours? Elim. It barely came out of my mouth. Our secret. Agreed. Faced with her smile, I would have agreed to anything. Agreed. Suddenly she was running off. I have to deliver this silly thing for next class. Remember, it's all funny. Think about it. Elim. She whispered my name, laughed, and disappeared behind the barrier. I didn't even say goodbye. I didn't even know what her proper designation was. I looked around and saw the pit. I tried to see what was funny about it, but my mind wasn't yet ready for this concept. I wasn't even sure that I had this mysterious sense of humor. Suddenly I felt angry. How dare she? She broke two rules that could get us both in serious trouble. And like a fool I told her my name. The use of our real names was a serious transgression. From the beginning it's drummed into us that the less security operatives know about each other in any given unit, the less they can divulge if they fall into enemy hands. I felt like I'd given up a precious secret to someone I didn't even know. Someone who seemed almost frivolous. There's nothing funny about Bamaran. As I walked off, I considered telling someone about this encounter. But how would they interpret my part in it? And what about a secrecy agreement I had made with Palandine? I didn't know what to do. But I did feel much better. Contains menu with 0 items. Menu book content text. 9 entry : Dr. Bashir is with Chief O'Brien. He should return at 1500 hours. Unless it's an emergency. I assured Nurse Jabra that it wasn't, nodded my thanks, and walked back out to the promenade. I stood there for a moment, trying to deny that I was upset. This was the umpteenth time I had come to invite the doctor to lunch, only to find that he was already engaged with the chief, playing darts, building models of old wars, battling ancient enemies in ancient flying machines in some holographic fantasy, or the latest diversion, listening to the insipid lounge music at Vic Fountains. Child's games. That's it, I decided. If he wants to have lunch he can damn well ask me. Bajoran nearly knocked me into the perfume display and continued on his way without so much as a glance back. I controlled my temper and followed him. The promenade was crowded, and I quietly negotiated the crowd until I made my way directly behind him. I slipped my left foot between his two legs, hooked his right ankle and pushed him hard in the small of his sweaty back with my left hand. He went down like a demolished building, taking 2 or 3 innocent pedestrians with him, and I peeled off to Quark's bar. As I entered I could hear the fight erupting. My action served a double purpose. Not only had the loud been dealt with, but Quark's now emptied out as the fight escalated. Louts and buffoons, and we're going to war to save them from the Dominion. Bajorans find it difficult to believe they can ever be on the winning side. More and more they seem to prefer the dark side. I wondered if the Kai's actions on the promenade haven't brought the entire society closer to the abyss. I sat down at the end of the bar instead of going to my usual place on the second level. I wasn't sure how long I wanted to stay. I just had to get out of the crowd and a grip on my feelings. I was in a dangerous mood. Ever since that ridiculous holosuite program, I thought, The spy game. Well, of course it's a game. It's all a game. But it's not a holosuite program. And yet, the moment Julian wounded me with his ridiculous weapon, everything changed. I thought it was a magnificent moment. He showed me that he had the spine to play the game as it ought to be played. But why then did he back off? Why couldn't he go beyond that moment? Why did our relationship end? ? Odo's voice was sharp enough to pull me out of my musings. He was standing next to me, with that mask of detached hauteur he wore when he decided you were the culprit. A mask upon a mask. Constable. What a pleasure. Have you had lunch yet? I asked. He just looked at me. Yes, I know, you don't eat lunch but join me anyway. I gestured to the stool next to me. He didn't move. Someone witnessed you creating the situation in the promenade, he said. A situation? Really? I so rarely create anything these days. What with the impending invasion? Did you attack a Bajoran by the name of Londar Parvis? Odo's sternness could be impermeable. I assure you, I am not in the habit of attacking people I don't know in public places. We got our feet tangled in the crush, and he went down just as, moments before, I nearly wiped out the scent display when he ignored the fact that I was standing in his path. I trust he's not hurt. I expect more from you, Garak, Odo lectured. We're all under a great deal of strain. As am I, Constable. Please, sit down at least. I feel like a schoolboy being disciplined by the docent. Book content. Text. Odo sighed and awkwardly perched on the bar stool next to mine. I waved off the approaching Ferengi barkeep. No doubt another relative of Quark's working for slave wages. I can't stay long. I have to finish dealing with this situation, I finished. You're very fortunate, Odo. How so? He asked. These people have come to trust you. They rely upon you. You've made a real connection here. Odo merely grunted. I was careful not to mention Major Kira, knowing how reserved he was on the subject. Do you still want to go home? I asked. The question startled Odo, and for a moment the mask of official reserve dropped from his face. This was the first time I had brought up the subject since his admission to me during the interrogation in the Romulan Warbird and Tane's ill-fated attempt to destroy the Founder's homeworld. I can't say, he replied ambiguously. Well, I can. There's certainly nothing here to keep me. I never told you how sorry I was about Zyral's death. Odo could be quite sensitive in such matters. You did, actually, I nodded. But thank you. Still, you and Dr. Bashir have created a strong bond. Not really, I answered quickly. I'm afraid that what I have to offer has run its course. It's certainly no match for Dart's. I heard the bitterness of my tone, and so did Odo. We sat in silence for a moment. I understand you'll be involved in the invasion. You must be pleased. Odo steered us away from the heaviness that had descended. Yes, I replied, grateful for the change of subject. It's very gratifying to know that I can be of some use to the effort. Odo was about to say something when he saw Quark approaching. He rose abruptly from the bar. I have to get back to work, he stated. When do you want to schedule your consultation? I asked. Odo, no doubt influenced by his budding relationship with the Major, was about to branch out sartorially. But it occurred to me that Quark was the last person he wanted to know about it. We'll talk, he replied, nodding to Quark as he briskly marched back to the promenade. What's his hurry? Quark asked. He has a situation out on the promenade, I said. A big fight? Sorry I missed it. What was that all about? The usual, I replied. People rushing to get home. Book content. Text. 10 entry: My solitary confinement was agony. The only way I got through it was to rethink all my attitudes about the pit and the wilderness and to focus on how I could make my stratagems more effective. Just as I had learned to do when Uncle Inabra and locked me in that suffocating closet. Was this the universal torture for failure? I wondered. I also thought of Palandine, constantly replaying our meeting in my mind. I felt more able to keep my despair at a distance, which in turn allowed me to breathe. When I returned, even the sessions in the pit weren't quite so disastrous. I did, however, notice the twinkle in Calyx's eyes when he was teaching. and that somehow helped ease my fear. The next time I was assigned to evade capture in the wilderness, I decided to wait until darkness before I made any effort to find my way back. I was left on the edge of a long, narrow rock formation that sloped down to the southern part of the Micker, where it was said that the last of the Hunj still lived. The Hunj were nocturnal flying predators whose medium size belied their strength and ferocity. Their swooping attacks were known to kill and carry off large cannons. They lived in subterranean nests during the day, and as I burrowed into an escarpment that offered a depression large enough to conceal me until night, I was trembling at the prospect of meeting one. The vision of wild Hunj, the intense heat, and my growing claustrophobic discomfort filled me with a choking anxiety. Not only would I fail again, I'd probably die horribly. I stayed absolutely still, counting my breaths. Just as I began to stem the rising panic, I noticed a movement in the earth in front of me. My first thought was the Hunj, and my heart thumped against my chest as if it wanted to flee my body. But the movement was more like the wind stirring the loose sandy soil. I was able to discern that it was being caused by a colony of desert Ragnars, reptilian creatures that are rarely encountered, and for good reason. They blend in with their surroundings with such transforming facility, that only by remaining still for so long was I able to detect them. They knew I was there, I'm sure, and they were attempting to move away from me. But they never panicked. They only made their moves when the wind or the shifting shadows masked their progress. I was totally absorbed and fascinated by these creatures. They moved in silent concert, fanning out multi-directionally so that the surface of the sand would just look as if a slight wind were rearranging the grains. It was the most elegant choreography. I observed how changes of color tone rippled across their skin as they moved between light and shadow, rock and soil. I counted 5 of them. They moved toward a deeper recess, which most likely led to a safe retreat. Somehow, I knew intuitively that they were my answer to this incredibly difficult situation. I also knew that in the dying light I would soon lose them forever, which felt the same as losing my last hope. I moved my right hand very slowly toward the closest Ragnar, amazed that I was able to maintain a steady control. With a sudden move I was even more amazed that I was able to grab hold of it, careful not to do it any harm. With my left hand I took the sun cover from my hat, filled it with the sandy soil, and placed the Ragnar inside. Before I closed it up, I noticed that although the creature had eyes, they didn't focus. This beautiful, magnificently adaptable creation of the wilderness was blind, and yet it had more sensory awareness than any technology we could ever imagine or invent. I closed the sun cover and placed the Ragnar in a safe pocket where it would not be crushed. I apologized to the others for disrupting their family. I explained that I had great need of this creature. Not only was Milet, as I eventually called him, the answer to my current problem, he was as important as any of the docents at Bamaran, with the possible exception of Calyx. When night came, I emerged from my lair. I was fortunate that none of the 3 moons were shining. Quietly, carefully, the hunting parties had already fanned out across the wilderness. I stood and allowed my cramped muscles to expand in the desert night. The Triluvian constellations were pulsing their complicated rhythmic patterns, indicating, according to Docent Rilan, an book content text. Advanced book content text. Advanced intelligence that astrophysicists were still attempting to decode. After hours spent buried alive in the suffocating heat and dust, the freshness, the clarity of the smells and sounds and feel of the night air against my skin was overwhelming. I was a new person, no longer intimidated by the task at hand. Unlike the last time, I had preparation and an ally. Thanks to Calyx and the recent work in the pit, I was finally learning how to sense an opponent's energy, to anticipate his attack and choose or change a stratagem in the moment. Everything gives off energy signals, he told us, and these signals were organized according to the electromagnetic field that undergirds all creation. The same is true with our intentions. They, too, are organized along these energy lines. If you train your awareness to be sympathetic, to tune into the interdependence of energies, then you can anticipate your opponent. Calyx told us that anticipation was just the beginning, and that as we grew stronger we would be able to foresense, by which he meant that we would be able to know who our opponents were before they appeared. Calyx then gave me one of his long looks, which included the unsettling twinkle. As I stood in the darkness of the wilderness, I first made certain that no one was near. Satisfied that I was not being observed by my hunters, I then used the prime Tuluvian constellation to orient myself directionally. Once I determined the direction of Bamaran, the hard work began. Between the rock formations lay great expanses of flat desert. During the day anything that moved in that expanse was exposed to the naked eye from a great distance. Plus the midday heat severely punished anyone foolish enough to be traveling out in the open. The Micker sun was a challenge even to heat-tolerant Cardassians. I had to cover as much distance at night and find rock cover by sunrise. Of course the hunters knew this, and while one had to be careful traveling at night, the real danger was not finding an undetectable niche during the day. And then there was my greatest fear: the more effective the hiding place, the worse my claustrophobia would fare. My earlier confidence began to ebb. I felt a slight movement from the pocket where Mila was. Whether or not that was one of Calyx's signals, I knew that I had to be on my way. I made good progress that night and early the next morning. Toward dawn I felt the presence of a night probe and flattened myself on the ground just before its faint beam knifed over me. I judged the direction it came from and adjusted accordingly when it felt safe to continue. I had sensed the signal before it appeared. That was a good sign. There was still perhaps an hour before light, when I encountered what looked like the dark outline of a badly constructed outbuilding. It was a tall rock formation that narrowed at the top. I was debating with myself whether to continue in the hope that I would find another formation before light when I heard the barely audible but unmistakable whistled signal and response of a hunting party. I scurried into the first opening I saw, the cranny that appeared to offer enough invisibility in the pre-dawn darkness. I entered and curled very quietly against the dead end. Above me was a slight overhang, and to my left the rock was depressed just enough for me to conceal most of my torso. My legs, however, no matter how tightly I pulled them against me, were visible to anyone standing outside and looking into the cranny. I also knew that the sun rose on the other side of the rock, and that this position would become untenable when it crossed over to my side and exposed me. Either I would be easily spotted or, if I weren't, baked to death. As the sun came up, the otherworldly beauty of the wilderness was gradually revealed by each succeeding gradation of light. I was deeply moved by the presence of so much color in what had initially looked like a dead world to me. Beginning with a cold pale gray, the dawn flowed through a range of blues and into the softest rose and pink and then to a hot red that soon gave way to the merciless bleached bone white of midday. I was able to see how much territory I had covered the previous night. Unfortunately, the hunting party I had overheard decided to use this rock formation as a base during the day, and sent out brief search expeditions in shifts. There were 3 of them, and they had found shelter in a place above the cranny and to my right. As I listened to their boring and desultory conversation I realized, ironically, they were part of the Furton group who had captured me in my last pathetic attempt. Judging from their voices, they were fairly close. I, book content text, prayed, not only that they would stay where they were, but that before the sun shifted to my side they would move on, so I could look for a less exposed haven. The morning wore on, and the hunters made no sign of moving. I became increasingly concerned. The sun was getting higher, and the overhanging ledge was now my last source of shade. At one point I took Mila out of his wrapping to check on his condition. At least that's what I told myself. I was afraid that if I was honest and admitted that the real reason was to solicit help from Ragnar, the slide into total insanity would be swift and sure. I was getting desperate. Just then one of the hunters decided to have a last look around before settling in for the blistering afternoon. As he detached from the group, I could hear that he was coming my way. Holding Mila to the side I scrunched myself into the space as tightly as I could and dug my feet into the sand. I didn't know what else to do. I looked at Mila, who was absolutely still. As he sensed my attention his coloration subtly adjusted to the exact color tones of his immediate area. I heard the crunch of approaching steps and closed my eyes in a childish attempt to disappear. All I could hear was my heart beating like a drum, and I was afraid that if it didn't give me away my rapid breathing would. I tried to hold my breath, but that only made each heartbeat more furious. I began to panic, and again looked at Mila, who was now barely visible. How did he remain so still, so self-possessed? I studied him as if my life depended on it. It was then that I noticed that his flanks moved ever so slowly as they filled with air, and slowly as they released. Then there was a long moment of no movement at all before the cycle began again. I surrendered to the same rhythm, and the pounding of my heart began to subside. The steps came to a stop just outside my cranny. I continued to breathe with my lips. Silence. I could now hear the hunter's breath struggling with the heat, and feel his directed energy as he inspected the opening. He must have been looking directly at me. I knew that somehow I had to depress my energy, avoid locking into his focus. Like my lip. Think of my lip. Blending from one moment into another. Moving at the edge of shade and light. Transforming with shifting hues as light changes angle and moves across surface. My focus flattened. My energy, slowed by the rhythm of my breathing, seeped out around me and was absorbed by the surrounding surfaces. I surrendered air limb correct and blew back all identity to the sand and rocks. And all the while I felt clear, calm, and guided. After what seemed like forever the hunter moved away. I remained in this suspension, this utter peace, until I became aware that the sun had lowered and was exposing me to its full force. I knew that I wouldn't last long, and that the move had to be made. My calmness, however, prevailed, and I knew what to do. I placed my lip on the ground in front of me and waited. His coloration again subtly adjusted to the change. Wherever he went I would follow, even into the depth of the rock formation if necessary. He moved to the opening. After a few more moves I painfully unwound myself, got as close to the burning sand as was possible and followed. Every time Milo made a soundless scurry I went with him. The ground heat was suffocating and my hands were screaming. It was a shock to experience my body again. We moved to the left, away from the hunters, who had obviously found shade. We stayed close to the rock and out of their sightline. I began to anticipate Milo's moves, and for a while we moved as one. How ridiculous this must have looked, a grown man scurrying after a Regner in the sand. But how liberating to discover resources and a teacher beyond the limits of conventional wisdom and pedagogy. 3 more members of the Furton group were on the other side of the rock formation, but Milo had found a hidden depression that required some quiet digging to get into, and we avoided detection. We settled in and resealed the opening with sand and loose rocks. After an indeterminate period, the Furton hunters left. As we waited for nightfall I fell into a deep sleep. My dreams were a jumbled mess of images and actions, at the center of which Palantine was laughing at something or someone I couldn't see. At one point I was awakened by the sounds and voices of another group. They were probing our immediate area. I was confident that we were secure. Take out your grapples and probe the hired opening. 3. If this merc is not caught, everyone shares the punishment. My heart jumped into my throat. It was the gruff voice. It took me a while to calm myself. But by then the group had passed. What merc? Me. Have all the others been captured? Surely. Contains start button.